morning, everybody. They ain't rung the bell yet, but we got a lot to talk about, so we're going to get started. Because we're going to try to get through all of chapter 22 this morning. It's only like 40-some verses. Easy. Easy. All right. Luke chapter 22, we're going to pick up verse 31. Remember, Jesus is engaged in the Passover feast with his disciples in the upper room. Judas has already been pointed out by Jesus as the one who is going to betray him. There's this argument over who will be the greatest in the kingdom. And then in verse 31, Jesus has really one last prophecy, a final prophecy that he is going to announce before he is arrested in the garden and taken away to be crucified. In verse 31 through 34, Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." But he said to him, that is, Peter says to Christ, "Lord, with you I am ready to go both to prison and to death." And he said, "I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you have denied 3 times that you know me." Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to break it down and just make a couple different points here. Number one, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago in the sermon that I preached on not being afraid of Satan. Satan asks for permission. Satan is not all powerful. Satan can't reach us unless God allows him and we allow him. Now, God has given us free will, but in this case, they are being protected by Christ. Of course, again, they don't have the final fulfilled prophecy yet of the Word of God. They don't have the Spirit to guide and direct them, and they don't have the Word in its complete and final form yet. And so there's still some special work going on that Christ, I believe, is protecting his core. But he's not taking away their free will. Now, it's also important to notice here, and this goes to something I said last hour about translations. When I read this in the English, who's Jesus talking to? He's talking to Peter. He says, "Simon, Simon." Now, in the Greek, when the name is repeated, there is a depth to it. There's a profundity to it that needs to be heeded. And that's why it's followed with "behold." And it harkens back to mind this. Remember when Jesus walks out of the city and turns around and says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." It's kind of that same thought, right? Jesus isn't angry with Peter here. He's not saying, "Peter, Peter, now listen to me." He's like, "Peter, Peter, please listen." There's a depth and a love to what he's saying here. But he's not just talking to Peter. Now, it seems that way in the English. Satan has demanded permission. The word there, Satan is... Well, we've talked about the fact that Satan is a liar, he's the father of lies. But also, Satan is, just as Satan is not all powerful, Satan is not all knowing either, is he? Satan doesn't know what's about to happen. He knows what he thinks about to happen, but he doesn't understand the full propensity to salvation and everything that's wrapped up in it, right? So Satan demands, the New American Standard says he demands permission. Some translations say he asked permission. The Greek word here, and this is really surprising to me, I guess it shouldn't be, but the Greek word here means to ask or demand for like you have a right to it. It's like Satan is saying to Jesus, I have a right to Peter, but not just to Peter. Satan has demanded or asked for permission to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. Here's the key. You, in verse 31 and 32 there, is plural. What's Jesus saying? He's addressing Peter directly, but what's he saying? Satan hasn't just asked for Peter. He's asked for all of them. He's asked for all of them. He wants to sift all of them like wheat. He wants to destroy the center, the core of Jesus' discipleship. If he can get to the 12, what can he do to the rest of them? And so, literally, we'll use Mississippi language. Simon, Simon, Satan has demanded permission to sift y'all like wheat. But I have prayed for y'all that y'all's faith may not fail. But you, Peter, singular. You, Peter, when you have turned, the word here means to be converted. It's the same word that we would use for somebody who's not a Christian and converts and becomes a Christian. He says, when you have converted. Well, what do we know by that? Well, does Jesus know what's going to happen? Well, sure, and he's about to tell him, isn't he? He knows what's about to happen. He knows that Peter's going to fall away, but have to be converted again. He says, when you are converted again, strengthen your brothers. Okay, does it? Okay, the King James says converted. Okay, I didn't look that up. That's good. So when you start to tie the front end of that to the back end of that, he talks directly to Peter, but he's talking about the 12. And in fact, we know, where is it? In Mark 14, Mark says that all forsook him. They all fled, didn't they? All 12 fled and forsook him. And so what he's saying here, he looks at Peter and he says, Satan has decided to have all 12 of you. He's already got Judas. He's just dealt with that. And he desires to have the rest of you. But I've prayed for all of you. But you're all going to forsake me. And when you have converted, Peter, strengthen them. Now think about what he's saying to Peter. And is he telling us something here about ourselves? Is there a lesson here for you and I as Christians today? How often do we fail the Lord? Have you ever failed him? Have you ever disappointed him? Have those in the church ever failed him and disappointed him? Has anyone ever forsook him? What should be our goal and our responsibility? First of all, you be converted. You repent. And then do what? Strengthen everybody else. Sometimes, and we'll talk more about this next hour, sometimes it's real easy to throw stones at other people's sins and ignore ours. Richard. That's correct.
I think about what Peter said. It's like a board line. If you see it doing, you make a vow. You go back and look at Job.
Right.
He's going back and forth. I'm going back and forth.
That's right.
Looking at the phone. And then that's exactly what he's done here.
That's right.
He's
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And here's another point with regard to that, Richard. Where are these guys at? Where are they at? Literally, physically, where are they at? They're in the presence of Jesus, aren't they? They're in the presence of God. They're sitting in the same room with him. They're eating at the same table. They're partaking of the same Passover feast with the Lord. Proximity to Jesus does not mean immunity from Satan. Well, I walk with Jesus every day. Doesn't mean you're safe. These guys are right there with him. Where's Judas before Satan enters him? Sitting right there. Right there next to Jesus. And Satan still is able to enter him because he lets him. Just because you're near him doesn't mean you're immune to that roaring lion, Richard, right? We've always got to be on guard. And then one other point here, and then I'll open up for more conversation if you want, or questions. At the end, I believe that the other four Gospels all say, you will deny me. But this is the only one where that Luke literally says, you will deny that you know me. You won't even say you know me. Now, I think that denying him means the same thing. I just think it's interesting that Luke is pretty specific about what Jesus says here. That you will deny me. But Peter responds and says what? Never. I'm ready to go to prison and even to death. And then Jesus says, before the rooster will not crow today until you have denied me 3 times that you know me. All right. So I prefaced this in the first hour. The discrepancy. Mark says that Jesus says that the rooster would crow twice. All 3 others say once. What's the discrepancy? Does anybody know how to answer this question? I think these are important things for us to be aware of. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I've never read anything. This is just like, I always thought, well, if you do it before the cock crows once, then you've also done it before the cock crows thrice. So,
Sort of, yes.
well, so I'm like, it'd be like me saying, before 3 weeks have passed, I'll do so-and-so. If I
Right.
do it, and then later on I say, well, before the end of the week I'll do so-and-so. Well, if I do it before the end of the week, I've also done it before 3 weeks.
True. I think. I was a little. I know you understand what you're saying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. Let me use a different illustration. Let me. How many halves are there to a football game? 2 halves. They're into the first half. Buzzer blows. Whistle blows. What happens at the end of the game? Another whistle blows. So if I tell you, I'll meet you after the whistle. But you know that means what? There are 2 whistles, and I'm going to meet him at the end of the game, after the final whistle, right? Now, if I tell somebody else, well, there's going to be 2 whistles, and then I'm going to meet him, have I contradicted myself? Or am I saying the same thing? I'm saying the same thing. In ancient Judea, roosters would typically crow once around midnight. In their time. Once around midnight. And again, about 3:30 in the morning, just before dawn. It was the second rooster crow that was like the ancient alarm clock for them. And so if their boss, master, says, you need to be at work when the rooster crows, they knew that meant what? Around 3:30 in the morning, before the sun comes up. That first rooster crow at midnight really meant nothing to them. In fact, all right, so we live close to the train track. Some of you have been on the phone with me, and I've been outside, and the train comes by, and I go, "All right, hang on a second," and he's got to blow one more time on the, yeah. It's gotten to the point now that the train goes by and we hardly ever hear it, right? Because we're used to it. They didn't pay any attention to the first rooster crow. It was midnight, but it was that dawn rooster crow that was the rooster crow. And so Mark is just more specific about which one. Mark says the rooster's going to crow twice, and it's before the second one you're going to. The other ones just say, they just speak of that second one, because most people ignored the first one. There's no discrepancy. Mark is saying the same thing that the other three are saying, just in a different way. Saying the exact same thing. So there's no discrepancy here. Okay? All right. Any other comments, questions? Like I thoroughly screwed that all up in your head? All right. It's the same thing. Just know it's the same thing. Anybody else? All right. So after this final prophecy, he delivers to them a new plan. Beginning in verse 35, he says, "When I sent you out without money belts and bags and sandals, you did not lack anything, did you?" And they said, "No, nothing." I love the way the New American Standard translates the thought of the language in the verse, because this is really more accurately how they would have understood the question. It's almost a hypothetical, right? And so they add that, "Did you?" at the end. I like that. "When I sent you out with money belts and bags and sand without these things, you did not lack anything, did you?" Well, no. You don't lack anything at all. Verse 36, he says, "But now, whoever has a money belt is to take it along. Likewise also a bag. And whoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy one." Let's stop there. What's he saying? And why is he saying it?
All fixing to seem like it's lost. I mean, you're fixing to have to scatter. They're all going to vanish. And then they're going to, and I think that's why Peter denies it. It seems like in his mind, they're always still expecting a earthly kingdom. It seems like.
Oh, I think there's a true sense in that, yes.
So they're like, oh no, our world's shattered.
Absolutely.
And it really is kind of going to be this road on until he.
Right. Again, while he's been with them, and when he sends them out on that limited commission, his what do I want to say? His guarding over them, his protection over them, and even with Satan, there's a sense of protection and that they have there. But he's about to be crucified. They're going to be scattered, and then he's not going to be there anymore. The Spirit's going to come and help them, but they're going to have to kind of fend for themselves now for a while, right? And so, make sure you've got the things that you need to protect yourself, to care for yourself, so that, because I'm not going to be here to provide it for you anymore, right? And then they ask him, or he says, verse 37, "This is why, because I tell you that this which is written must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors. For that which refers to me has its fulfillment." So again, why is he telling them this? Because he's about to go to the cross and die. He's going to be numbered against the transgressors. And if they're following him and he's numbered with the transgressors, what's that going to make them? Transgressors as well. So you're going to have to protect yourselves. Okay? Then they said to him, "Look, here are 2 swords." And he says, "It is enough." Now, what does he mean when he says it is enough? What he's saying literally in the text is, for now, that's enough. You know, they think that they're going to get up and go out and go fight a worldly kingdom. We've got to go. Peter says, "I'm willing to go to prison and to death with you." They said, "We've got 2 swords. And he says, "That's enough for now." Why? Is 2 swords enough to take on the Roman army? So what's he mean? His kingdom was, what's he going to tell Pilate? It's not of this world, right? My kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my servants would have fought. What's Peter do in the garden here in a few minutes? He's going to try to fight, right? What Jesus is saying is now is not the time to use the sword. 2 swords is enough. We don't need more. That's not why we're here, okay? He's not saying that we should be pacifists and we shouldn't be able to own a gun to protect ourselves or our families or anything like that. He's saying for now, that's enough. Because this is the intent. And they don't get it, obviously. Do they understand what he means when he says he's going to be numbered with the transgressors? No, they don't get it. Okay. Anything else? Then we get to verse 39. And if I am ever fortunate enough, if I'm ever blessed enough to be able to go to Jerusalem, to go to the Middle East, and I don't know if I want to go right now. Some stuff going on over there. But if I ever get a chance to go, there's a lot of things I would like to see. But Mike, if I could just go and spend one evening in the Garden of Gethsemane, that would be enough. I just to be there and remember what the Lord was going through that night. Verse 39 says he came out and proceeded as he was accustomed to the Mount of Olives. Bless you. And the disciples also followed him. Now it's interesting that Luke uses this, and talks about them following him. They're still following him. Now some others say he takes Peter, James, and John, goes a little further, right? But Luke doesn't see it necessary to talk about all that. He just says that when he arrived to the place, he says to them, pray. Now he's going to say this again at the end of this, but he says, pray that you might not enter into temptation. What's he telling them? When the storm's coming, is there anything more important than prayer? When the temptation is at the door, is there anything more important than prayer? I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's pretty hard to sin while you're praying. I've always found that when I'm feeling tempted or when I'm feeling down, that stopping and taking a moment of prayer helps that moment pass. It keeps me. And he tells them, Satan has desired to have all of you. And I'm fixing to go to the cross. And you're gonna deny me. Temptation's going to come. You need to spend some time in prayer that not happen. And he withdrew himself about a stone's throw. And he knelt down and he began to pray, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Now, other accounts tell us, Matthew 26, he does this 3 times, right? Throughout the night. But what's he saying here? And I kind of like the fact that Luke truncates this into this simple prayer of agony. This painful, passionate prayer of Jesus. Does a prayer have to be long and wordy and windy and boring to be effective? This is a personal, passionate, simple. What's he saying? Does he want to go to the cross? And I'm not sure, none of us, I don't think, Dale, none of us wanted to be crucified. But I don't think it's the crucifixion he's worried about. Does he know what is going to happen during that crucifixion? What's he going to have to do? He's going to bear the sins of all mankind for all time. He's going to bear the wrath of God on those sins. The Father's going to have to turn his back on him, and he's going to have to bear that wrath for hours until the wrath of God is placated, till the sacrifice is made. And this is something we don't talk a lot about, but we talked about it last week. Jesus sitting there at the table talks about the Passover lamb, and it's interesting that he is the Passover lamb, right? When that lamb is slaughtered and consumed, it no longer gets to be a lamb anymore, right? It no longer is of use to the person who first had it. What's Jesus giving up? You know, sometimes we think, well, Jesus just died on the cross. I'm telling you, he gave up a whole lot more than that. Everything changed when Jesus bore our sins on the cross, when he became the sacrifice. He gave up something that we can't even imagine. I believe that. Now, I think we'll understand it fuller when we get to heaven. Oh, yeah.
You know, they might be looking at dying. They might know I'm in a hospital, I'm not getting better, I'm going to have to die, and you have this fear of death still.
Right.
And you're like, well, part of you might think, well, if I had faith like I should, why am I scared? Right. I really had the kind of faith I should have when Jesus is
Yeah.
real,
There's fear here. There's trepidation about what's to come and what he's going to have to go through. Any of you ever watched the series Band of Brothers? I just started watching it, and there's one part in it where there's a young private in World War II, and he's scared. He's in a foxhole. And the lieutenant walks up to him, and he tells him about his fear and how when he had parachuted in, he was afraid. He didn't go look for his company, try to find somebody to fight with. He just stayed there because he was scared. And the lieutenant looks at him and says, "We're all scared." It's just how you react to the fear, right? Having faith and trust in the Lord doesn't mean we're not ever going to be afraid. And that's okay. How we respond to it is the question, right? Yes.
This is one of those places where you see that Jesus is the name
Yes.
almost above everything else. You know, the fear that he had, when you touch on the prayers, what it means when we mumble that prayer, when we face a temptation, and we mumble the prayer, that you may change your determination always. Your determination to do this sin.
Right.
It seems to me that when that happens to me, I'm more determined not to do that. If I just think just a moment.
Right. Well, okay, so let's look at it. Let's look at it from the perspective of the text a little further. His response to his fear was still what? Not my will, but yours be done. And then how does God respond to his prayer? In this case, he responds immediately by doing what? Verse 43, the Father sends an angel to do what? To strengthen him. To encourage him. Now, what is an angel? It's a messenger. You wonder what the angel said to Jesus. Do we have a messenger? When we're afraid, we can pray and still go to the messenger, the Word of God, to encourage us, to strengthen us. right? It's not just prayer, but God has sent us the encouragement that we need. But even then, notice the next verse. And being in agony, he was praying fervently, very fervently. Is he still afraid? Even though he's prayed and God has sent a messenger to comfort him and encourage him, is he still afraid? Has the fear left? No. In fact, his sweat became then, literally, after he's prayed the prayer the first time and the angel has come to strengthen him, he continues to pray very fervently, and then his sweat became even like drops of blood. That doesn't mean we're never going to be afraid. But here's, I think, and I've said this for years, and I believe this to be true. I think verse 45 is where he defeats the cross. And he rose from prayer. I think it was at that moment nothing was going to stop him from doing what he was doing. He knew the answer. Okay, so what was his prayer? What was his initial prayer? Does God answer our prayers? Well, sure he does. Did God answer Jesus' prayer? Sure, he just didn't answer it the way Jesus wanted him to answer it. Well, he did. Sort of. What was Jesus' initial prayer? Let this cup pass from me. All right, stop. Did God answer that prayer? Yeah. What was his answer? His answer was no. Sometimes God says no. But then he said, not my will, but your will be done. Did God answer that prayer? And how did he answer it? Yes, my will be done. And when Jesus rises from prayer, I think it was done. He had defeated the cross. Nothing was going to stop him. And I think the rest of the story bears that out as we look at it. He stands before his accusers. He doesn't say anything. When he finally does, he admits that he is the Christ. He knows what that's going to bring. He willingly goes and lays down his life. We'll talk more about this when we get there. And I've said this before. If they were taking you or I away, Dale, to be crucified, how would you go? Would you go peacefully? What'd Jesus do? From what I understand of the text, when he got there, Jesus laid down and stretched out his arms. And he allowed him to do it. They'd had to hold me down. Right? And he gets up, and then his first thought is what? His disciples. And he goes to them, and he finds them praying, sleeping from sorrow. Now, I get it. Have you ever been afraid, fearful, sad, sorrowful? Normally, whenever I feel those emotions, it makes me tired. Right? Sometimes it's easier to go to sleep when you're feeling all those things, right? And have they been doing what the Lord had said? Had they been praying? No. Jesus overcame the temptation by what? What happens to them? They all deny and scatter. Why? Maybe because they didn't spend that night praying? Just surmising. And he tells them, verse 46, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray. So he says it again. Pray that you might not enter into temptation. And again, Mark 14, verse 50 says what? They all forsook him and fled. Thoughts, comments on that? All right, so we come to the point of no return. Verse 47, while he was still speaking to his disciples, a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? This is how you're going to betray me. You've sold me out, and you're going to come out here and pretend to be my friend? You're going to embrace me and hug me, and you're betraying me? Really? When those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? One of them, I love this. And maybe it's because, where's Luke getting his source material from, most likely? A couple different places. Well, obviously he's getting it from the Holy Spirit when he's writing it. But how much of it has he got from the Apostle Paul? Right? We're going to see that when we get into Acts. Mark was with them. Mark was a student of Peter and a traveling companion of Peter. That some of the Gospels probably had already been written, at least maybe Mark's had already been written. But I find it interesting that Luke doesn't name names here. John, however, doesn't have any problem with it. In John 18 and verse 10, he says Peter did it. And the guy he cut his ear off, that was Malchus. But Luke just says here that one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And Jesus answered and said, stop. No more of this. Now, I wish there was a way, Richard, we could read this text and get more of a vivid picture of what's going on here. It's about to be melee, right? I mean, there's a fight happening, and Jesus has to kind of step in and stop them. Both sides. I mean, you talk about the tension. It's dark. They've got torches, and Peter takes out his sword, and he already attacks. I mean, and then Jesus touched his ear and healed him. What do you think Malchus thought after this was all over? Don't you wish, Greg, you can go back and talk to Malchus?
I want to know the story from there on.
Yeah, exactly. Oh. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and the elders. And again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. I think this is, again, one of the reasons why I don't think the betrayal was just the kiss. I mean, that was the sign of who they were to take. But there was more to it than that, because did they know who Jesus was? Well, sure. On several occasions, they were going to take him by force. Jesus says in verse 52, to the chief priests and officers of the temple and the elders who had come against him. So they're still in the garden. He says, have you come out here with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours. They did it at night. Why? They were afraid of the people. They were afraid of the Romans and what might happen. It was during the Passover. They didn't want to cause an upruckus in the middle of all the multitudes of people. So they go and they take him in the middle of the night. Don't I know it? Yeah, it is. I don't want to really get into this next section. I know I said I was going to try to get through the chapter, but I knew that was a tall task. Any other thoughts or comments? We got maybe a minute or two, but somebody say something and we'll be done. Anybody? I heard it too, so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is just one of those random bad things, but how many chief priests were there?
Well, there was only supposed to be one.
Well, I mean, first question, is a chief priest the same thing as a high priest?
Yes. But the problem is I think so. Let me rephrase that. I believe so. I may be wrong. That's my understanding. Now, the thing is, the Romans would recognize one, while sometimes the Jews would recognize a different one. Then, one of the high priests would step down, retire, or whatever. The next one would come in, but he was still considered a high chief, or a chief priest, or a high priest, or a chief priest. Yeah. And so there could be multiples at any given time. There was only supposed to be one who was the acting high priest, or chief priest.
And the reason I guess I wondered whether it's the same. I get what you're saying because there was a discrepancy,
Right.
like they wanted to appoint their own people.
Correct.
And, but it says the chief priest
Correct.
came with the soldiers to get it. I'd have a hard time if it was the same as a high priest, thinking that the Roman appointed high priest and the one the Jews thought was a high priest both said, hey, let's hook up together and walk out here with these soldiers.
But there were a lot of times, again, there was a familial line, and there could be several still alive, and they formed kind of this bond in this group that kind of led everybody else. Yeah. I'll look into that a little bit more, though. Yeah. All right. We'll pick up in verse 54 next week. Thank y'all.